Okay, so welcome. We are working on under the sort of umbrella term of community snapshots. Today, we're going to be doing a couple of things. So dispositionally, like if you were thinking about what was Elizabeth trying to do with our brains during this hour, my hope is that we spend time observing and being curious. I hope that we spend time capturing the heart of what we see as we understand it, acknowledging that there are limitations to our understanding, and then also seeking to connect. So those are kind of the dispositions that we're aiming for. And in order to do that, we're going to take a couple of different strands and braid them together. So we're going to be taking segments of a short story. Just for time's sake, I'm going to be segmenting what is already a pretty short story into little bits, again, to that idea of snapshots. We're going to be kind of weaving those bits together, but then also we're going to be weaving in one particular photograph by Dawood Bey, whose work is represented on the screen here. These are some earlier portrait photographs that he did as part of a series. He did portrait photographs in Harlem and also in Washington, D.C. It happens that I'm sharing with you some of the images from Washington, D.C. here. And with the acknowledgement that I am not representing the same community as Walter Dean Myers did in his book 145th Street Stories, we are, instead of looking for the photographs to be illustrations of community, we're going to be looking for the heart or themes that we can use to connect so that we can better understand our understanding of community, how we are shaped by community, and how communities are represented both in text and in photographs. So that's that. The artist, Gail, is Dawood Bey. Thank you, Melissa. I appreciate that. And the spelling is in the chat box. So that's what we're aiming to do together today. And just as I promised, for those who joined us early, there is a warm-up that I've issued. This is just a get your brain going, literally a warm-up. And so it is just for you. I've invited folks to write about these questions on the side with the intention that they start to think about the challenge and opportunity of grabbing a moment to represent a community that they hold dear to their heart, and also the challenge and opportunity of writing about a group of people that they care deeply about. And just as a reminder, as we go through our time together, we'll be recording. So there, off to the races, off we go. Okay, so I am going to start with a little bit from the author himself, because I love this video and I think it's really helpful to kind of understand before we dive into small groups, kind of analyzing the bits and pieces of the short story that hopefully you've read. If you haven't, it's okay. You'll only need to read a little bit to get along with your group. I want to spend time with Walter Dean Myers because in this video, he does a fantastic job of doing a lot of great modeling for us. And so I wanted to issue a challenge to you. As you listen to what he's saying, as you notice his body language, as you notice the pedagogy that he's enacting in this video, would you please just drop things? We're going to just kind of take an inventory, as we often do, in the chat box. So I'm going to play the video for you. It's going to be like 3 minutes, and then we're going to kind of talk about what did we see. So I'm going to unplug my headset so that everyone here. And then I'm going to wait for the little thing to go away, and then we'll see what happens.
Did you ever do a story about your life, not like in the city, but how your life was you had the bad times?
I've done an autobiography of my life called Bad Boy. I was very lucky in teachers. I had a 6th grade teacher. I was put into his classroom because I fought so much and he was a tough guy. And he convinced me that I was smarter than I was tough. I was also handicapped to an extent. I spent 10 and a half years, 11 years in speech therapy. I couldn't speak very well for most of my childhood life. So when I wasn't playing ball or fighting someone, I would be home with my books. Books were my friends.
I do the pictures for my dad's books, okay? For this book, it's my daddy. And this is what we do together. We made this book, Harlem. These are all pictures of people and places and things that I grew up around. Did you guys grow up around these same things?
Are you still growing up?
And you're still growing up around these things, right?
But books transmit values. So if you pick up a book and you read a book, you say the people in this book were valuable enough to record their lives, to record their neighborhoods.
Do you guys ever hear anything about where you live that's not so good?
There's too much violence. There's a lot of bad people.
What are the good things?
People plant flowers and plants.
People get along and they play together, no matter what color you are.
I'm going to draw for you, okay?
Okay.
So Dad is going to work with you on the story, and whatever you bring me, whatever you say, and whatever you talk about, I'm going to draw for you. You ready?
Yeah.
Let's do it.
All right.
All right, so I'm going to plug in my headset. That's just a little clip. And Laurel, welcome. I'm glad you joined us. So anything that grabbed you about that, anything about the way that he interacted with the students in the room, any of the ideas that he shared aloud, any of the big concepts that were alluded to, either drop them in the chat box, or if you'd be willing to share your voice with the group, I'd love to hear what captured your attention. Melissa, jump in.
I liked how they pull the kids in by asking, you know, have you heard bad things about your neighborhood? But then also, what kind of good things have you heard about the neighborhood? You know, what not heard, but what's good about your neighborhood?
Love. Okay. Anybody want to add to that? Collaboration. Thank you, Stephen. Can you tell me more about that? What did you see him doing that was collaborative?
He was sharing his experiences with his father and how they collaborated on a book. And then he elicited information from the students. And then he was willing to be the illustrator once they turned ideas over to him for illustrations.
Beautiful. All right. I love this. I'm seeing some additional thoughts coming in. Sonia has said he humanized himself to the students, which I love. Oral biography, a great way to go around disabilities for some kids. So what a wonderful thing for an author, Walter Dean Myers, who grew up with, speech issues, that he has actually incorporated his own way of understanding the world and accommodated students who might have a similar concern. Stephen mentions some sense of place. Anne says told things about his personal story. Melissa saying for sure that's another important thing. And Stephen's also adding that students are invited to tell stories of their own neighborhood. Gail, I see that you have your hand up. Do you want to share something aloud?
Well, I was going to say that he also gave the possibility of a future, because he said it's still like this and you're still living. So it's going to, that took away from it. So he was like, I grew up in it and you're growing up in it and we will still grow up in it. And then they asked for the possibilities, like the future tense for things too, kind of saying that what could we still do?
Beautiful. I love this. So this is not a fixed thing. There's change and growth and more collaboration to come. Anne is adding, he's discussing how he was always fighting until a teacher told him that he was smart and introduced him to books. And I love the idea of books being your friends for a bookish person. That doesn't sound sad. That sounds kind of lovely. So maybe other people see that a different way. So, okay, we have Walter Dean Myers. We have this man who has written the book 145th Street, and within it, the very first story in the edition that I have is Big Joe's funeral. And when so we open the book, we see the table of contents, Big Joe's funeral, then the baddest dog in Harlem. And it opens the way I see it. Things happen on 145th Street that don't happen anywhere else in the world. I'm not saying that 145th Street is weird or anything like that, but it's like intense. So when I heard about Big Joe's funeral, it didn't take me by surprise. It was something that I remember, and that's why I'm telling it. This is the way it went down. And for 14 pages, we get this kind of singular event, right? So anybody want to jump in and describe, like, what is Big Joe's funeral according to you right now for your first or second read? What happened? Don't worry about raising your hand, just unmute and share. I love other people's voices.
Yeah.
So I could say, real briefly, he was experiencing his own funeral.
This is an unusual situation, right? Tell me more about
making it a celebration instead of what it usually is.
Okay, so he held a funeral for himself while he was alive, right? He decides like, why save this until I'm gone and can't appreciate it? Anything more that happens in this story that you feel like is important for understanding the whole of it?
I think it's from the young people's point of view.
Ooh.
And they realize that Big Joe is a character. And so the young people are aware and reacting. And for example, 3 of the girls with their protest signs felt it was so important to inform the public that it's not real. And yet the narrator is so caught up in it, like, how can this, what's going to happen? What happens first, next, and last? And will there be trouble? And so I think different points of view from the young people, but it's definitely from their perspective.
Sure, we have Peaches with her sign, Big Joe is not dead. Like, I can't even imagine writing that sign, but I love it. I love it. Okay, anything more? Is there one last thing that we need to add in, just in case everybody hasn't had a chance to read all the way through, something that's important?
I thought the fact that he sold his insurance policy in order to finance the whole thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so the narrator goes from thinking it's a ridiculous idea at the beginning to understanding it at the end.
Beautiful. Okay, so now we have the whole arc. And the reason that I want to call that out is because you all are incredibly busy people, and so you may not have had a chance to read the whole story, but now you have the gist. And like I said at the very beginning, we're going to just like take some chunks, and you're going to go into work groups. I'm going to put you into, we're 15 people, so I'll put you into 5 groups. There'll be 3 of you, so high accountability, haha. You are going to go into the work group, and you are going to find your excerpt in a Google Drive folder that I have ready for you. I'm going to drop it in the chat box. All of these directions appear at the top of the page, so no stress. Like, you don't have to remember all of this, but for those that hear things better than they read things, you're going to find your excerpt in the file called Big Joe's Funeral. So if you're group 1, you're doing excerpt 1. If you're group 2, et cetera, right? Then somebody's going to read it aloud. And then you're going to discuss the prompts. And then when you've kind of gotten through your discussion, my challenge to you is that somebody is going to go into the small group discussion 1 document. And in that document, just kind of jot down, what did you guys talk about? Because each of you have a slightly different section of the text. And so as we move through the text, we'll see that the sentence, words, phrases will be different, of course. And then also for this challenge of making the characters have interior lives, as Stephen mentioned earlier, there are a lot of different characters and a lot of different points of view. So you'll each be talking about different characters in the text. And I think this is worth calling out that Walter Dean Myers, as a writer, would start out with a 6 or so page outline for an entire book. And then once he felt like he had like a pretty solid idea and he knew that this was a book and not just an idea, he'd start to flesh things out. So when he was writing a whole book, he would aim for 30 scenes. And each scene was meant to have some kind of action that kind of like moved the story along, but also demonstrated something. So I hope I have captured some of the scenes that kind of hold an idea. And that's how I've chunked the text out the way that I have. So I'm going to have to figure out really quickly how to do breakout rooms, which I'm always a little bit weird about. Hey, I found it. Before I send you into great breakout rooms, does anybody have any questions or concerns? All right, my friends, I am sending you to breakout rooms, and you'll be there for, just from a time management perspective, you'll be there for about 7 minutes, and then you'll get the 1-minute warning, okay? So I'll see you again soon. Bye. Oh my gosh, friends. I did it to you again, where I gave you such a big question and insufficient time. My apologies. I'm going to share with you on the screen here for the benefit of folks who are joining us with the recording, but please feel free to continue jotting things down. So if you were like the scribe for your group, don't stop, just keep going. But instead of like telling us each thing about your particular section, I wonder if you'd be willing to just briefly reflect on what is your big takeaway from that conversation that you just had? What's a big idea that you're going to bring forward with you?
I would say community, and because that is the underlying thing. We were talking about we were in the excerpt 2, so it was the second thing where they were talking about the insurance policy and the starts of the planning of, remembering Freddie's funeral. And then, I don't know if you want to call it security per se, but they all are comforted. They all know what's going on in the neighborhood with each other. And if they don't know that person, they still know that person. It's not like they're, what's it called? Like a chatterbox where they're just like spreading news. It's like it's happening to them in their lives. They all know what's going on with each other because it's such a close-knit community.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. Thank you. Anybody want to add to that thought, challenge that thought?
Well, we were in group 3, and I think that would be what we would say as well. Community. We were just so impressed by the amount of knowledge they had of one another's lives. And, I can't remember characters, but this is so-and-so whose husband was run over when he went down to buy a lotto ticket. Yeah. And this is so-and-so who sings in a band. And this is so-and-so who, there was some epithet and some very personal piece of information given about each character. And all 3 of us commented that we certainly don't know that depth of information about our neighbors. And someone commented, which I thought was really interesting, was because they're always moving. We live in a world that's so much more fluid that you probably we don't get that depth of knowledge about somebody, where you get the impression that these people have all lived there all their lives.
Mm-hmm. And Laurel actually added 2 words together, which I think is just beautiful encapsulation: a family neighborhood, which it's durational, it's generational. There's a familiarity goes times 10, it sounds like. Yeah. Anybody, one last thought before we move along?
I'd like to jump in on.
Please do.
On this. So Victoria and I were talking about the funeral part. So the environmental conditions of the neighborhood, right? During the summer, how hot it is in the city, but then also thinking about heat in multiple forms or as a metaphor.
Yeah.
We got a lot of different types of heat from, law enforcement comes into the picture.
Yep.
And, the other conflicts and tensions. And so the funeral parlor is the coolest place in the neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
And so the funeral in many ways offered a sort of a refuge, a relief from the various types of heat that are present in the neighborhood. And so we were toying with that, exploring with that idea a little bit.
Beautiful.
We were working
okay, Elizabeth.
Yeah.
This is Stephen. I would like to share about our word, because it does seem a little maybe far out. But if you're a teenage boy, whatever age he was, and you had an opportunity to ride in a limousine on a typical day, and you would set up whatever was necessary to get aboard.
Yep.
And you would be elbow to elbow with people you may know very well or you may barely know, but you would have an opportunity to observe people and to hear comments and remarks. And so as a writer, I'm thinking the author telling this story is showing how he really, he put himself in a position to get stories. and you get stories from people around you, and piling into a limousine with a group of eccentric people would be hilarious to me. And as a child, I would have been right there squeezing in too.
Sure. Well, and I it's so interesting you shared that, Stephen. I'm glad you did, because also it connotes to me like status, right? So it's similar to what other Stephen was saying earlier. There's the kind of the dual meaning of cool and hot, but then also status. In this case, it's the status of within the neighborhood. Like I get into the limousine and I get to be close to those stories. I get to be in with the people who are special enough to be in the limousine. But then on a like a broader like socioeconomic level, limousine connotes status as well. So that was how I was reading that word. I'm really glad you shared your reading of it. Okay, so we could talk about this forever, and I'm skimming way faster than you would do with your students. And I know this drives people totally crazy, so I apologize. But I do want to make sure that we get to the photograph. And in order to get there, I want to introduce you briefly to Dawood Bey, because his process is really important for understanding the complexity of the photographs themselves. Because kind of similar to the text where, you know, it might seem like it's kind of like, a cute story about a weird thing that happened in the neighborhood. And then you spend more time with it. All of a sudden there's a basement, and there's an attic, and there's like a spaceship blasting off in the sky levels of depth, right? So we have to kind of spend a little minute understanding Bey. And so as you did before, I want you to just like capture ideas, things that seem important for understanding him. So Bey's parents actually met in Harlem before they moved to Queens. Their intention when they moved was to give their two sons a suburban lifestyle that had been made inaccessible to many Black families in America because of segregation and white flight. His father was an engineer. His mother was a homemaker. They had a backyard. They had a library. They had encyclopedias. They had poetry at home. So this is a really solidly middle-class Black family. And actually, he found that confused his white teachers because they kind of expected Black students to fall into a particular category. So then when he started to use photography, and there's a lot about him that I'm not going to be able to cover here, which is really, I think, worth learning more about. But as you can see on the screen, he describes that he begins with a subject, which is to him a deep interest in wanting to describe the Black subject in a way that's as complex as the experiences of anyone else. It's meant to kind of reshape the world one person at a time. And he goes on to say in a different article, the best work tends to result not from the imposition of an idea on a situation, but from being responsive to what is going on once you get there. Otherwise, what results is merely the illustration of an idea. The idea is still meaningful because it's the impetus that got you out the door. But once you get there, the work has to be driven by the experiences you're actually having, the people you're actually meeting, and your best attempt of honestly and clearly describing those encounters. So kind of what's important, you can share aloud or in the chat box, kind of what's important to hold on to as we move forward. What is Bey up to? Insightful, love, anything more? What's he up to? Honestly and clearly describing. Thank you, Deborah. Yeah, I stepped on somebody. Jump in.
I was just going to say he's focusing on the individual and the actual experiences. So very specific, not just a general concept.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Melissa's added in the chat, as a street photographer, he seems dedicated to the idea of engaging with his subjects on an ongoing basis, right? Okay, so this is really lovely because a street photographer, when I think of that, I think of like literally a snapshot. Like I saw a person on the street, I said, your outfit's great, your look is interesting, this is an interesting moment, whatever. I grabbed that picture and then I moved on with my life. But something about this seems to be perhaps a little bit more engaged. Stephen's adding getting viewers familiar with people they know nothing about. So I like that phrasing too, because the intention of individuality, the intention of showing that these people have an inner life, which is part of what Bay is up to, is it's not just showing what they look like, but also showing a depth and a personality and an individuality and a wholeness. Donna's added antidote to using photography for commercial or advertisement, which offers up inaccurate portrayals. Beautiful. So now we're starting to kind of think about the manner in which people are represented and the manner in which photographers, authors, other people can represent a community or a people or a person, right? So I want to introduce you to a photograph of Bay's. And again, this is not Harlem. This is actually Washington, D.C., which I think is a really interesting, for those of us in the D.C. area, an interesting way in with our students. So let's slow down, as we did with the text, where I challenged you to look for little bits and pieces to kind of add up to a whole story. What do you notice first? Like, what draws your eye into this photograph?
Direct gaze. Person in the front.
Yep.
In the front, yeah.
He knows we're here. Okay.
Yeah, he's looking at the photographer.
Okay. Where does your guy go next?
Elizabeth, I taught school in Washington, D.C.
Yep.
And the young man on the right looks so very much like a student I taught, who invited me to his Catholic church in Southeast DC. It was important that I be there for his baptism.
Oh, cool.
And this child's face could be his twin.
Oh, wow. So you have a deep personal, immediate connection to that. That's awesome. And that face is being noted also by Laurel and Cynthia, this young man whose eyes take us outside of the frame. So there's something happening out there that has caught his attention, perhaps. Where does your eye go next?
For me, it kind of has like a W kind of effect, because the person in the front is looking at you. Yep. Then the next closest or highlighted area is his shoulder, which if you follow that, it guides you over to his arm, to his hand, and then it takes you to the boy. And then the boy's looking out and telling you where to go. So there's a lot of lines, like horizontal lines, bringing you back and forth throughout the work. With the bricks, with his shirt, with the door and the windows, like it's constantly like investigating the whole entire piece.
Thank you.
I can't figure out that metal bar that he seems to be leaning on. It looks like it might be a door, but his arms are through it.
I think that's the back of a stop sign or a parking sign or something. In other words, we're not seeing the top of the sign, but we're seeing what's holding it up.
But he's right in the doorway.
It looks like a door without a screen, like the screen is out, which kind of includes like what's the weather like, because he's, shirtless. The other kid has a long sleeve shirt on, the screen's out, so like there's nothing to protect his house if, from bugs or weather or whatever that comes, that screen door normally protects with.
I think it's completely outdoors, and this is just a sign that Bay has used to basically bisect the photograph, that big iron bar.
So we're seeing some differences here, right? And like in the significance of that bar. Stephen is mentioning in the chat box the inside and outside of the home. Perhaps Deborah is adding that he's reaching through the door. The tiny detail that it literally has taken me probably 20 minutes of looking at this photograph to notice is that he actually has his finger up. So he's like resting his arm on something horizontal, and then his finger is up on the left side of this bar. So my reading of it is that it's a security door, that it's like the metal door that comes before the door of the home. That's how I read it. I don't know if that's right, but that's the detail that I'm hanging on to at this moment. Anything more that you think is worth calling attention to in this photograph?
brick exterior seems to be recently painted.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And that little white box under his arm, I don't know, is that a doorbell or I'm not sure what it is. Or maybe it's latched to the door.
So there's this is the beauty, right? This when we come together in conversation, at first it's like if I made an inventory, if I just asked you like what is in this picture, it's like bricks and two people and some doors maybe and like a bar. It doesn't seem like there's a lot here, and then we spend more time playing with it and we realize we do in fact have some questions and some curiosities. So what I do also want to call your attention to is the light. So for the photographers in the room, where is the light source in this picture?
Coming from the right, I think.
Okay, coming from the right.
Upper right.
And above.
Okay. Upper right and above. Okay. Any other places are catching light? I'm not fishing, I'm actually asking because like I said, I don't have a...
From the photographer, wherever the photographer is, or off to the right of the photographer, because that's where it's...
You might, I would like to just say as a photographer that he's done a great job of capturing a huge range of blacks and whites and everything in between. The bright parts of the picture aren't blown out. The blacks aren't what we say blocked up. You can see detail in everything.
Thank you. So this is important information for me to better understand this photograph. It took me for a while to start to figure out like, okay, what's kind of exceptional about what Bay is up to in this photograph. And what I learned is about the challenge and opportunity of photographing dark skin in natural light, and how in order to create the depth and individuality of faces so that features don't get muted by shadow, it requires that the photographer kind of wrap the sitter in light. And I appreciated that because it helped me also think about the level of thought and effort that actually went into the photograph that seems so spontaneous. Can you see any other evidence of thought and effort in what could seem like a spontaneous photograph?
I come back to the way the photograph is kind of divided almost exactly down the middle by that bar.
Mm-hmm.
And yet the boy on the left features, his face isn't impacted by it at all. He's kind of framed that face within the left-hand side, and he's framed the boy on the right within the right-hand side of the composition.
So they're two individual boys.
Yes.
Okay. Laurel's adding the weight of the displacement of the boy on the right. So while the figure on the left is taking up more of the photograph, the figure on the right has sort of a weight that kind of feels balanced, which I appreciate. There's also a diagonal line of the figure on the left who is taller, and the figure on the right who is not as tall is almost a parallel to the line of the arm rested on this whatever it is, the door or the stop sign or whatever. And what I think is really interesting when we start to learn more about Bay and his process is that he actually spends a good deal of time. Like, he doesn't know these people necessarily. He'll often say, hey, I'd like to take a picture of you. Would that be okay? And he spends time with folks, letting them kind of become comfortable in front of the camera. And the way he describes it is they together kind of start to compose a photograph wherein the people are displaying their own behaviors rather than him saying, this is what the photograph is supposed to look like. And his intention, as you see, is this idea of kind of a rich humanity and an interiority, which I think is a really interesting way of exploring a subject. How do you show a person's face, but also show their depth? And with that, I want to bring us back together. And so my challenge to you here is just to scroll back through the chat box to look at the words that you captured during your small group session, and then just take a minute to kind of digest. What, if anything, connects these two creators or their creations? What are they both up to? Historians. Relational dimension of cultural production. Stephen, I'm going to need a little more help than that. Would you be willing to unmute and share a little aloud? What do you have in mind?
Yeah, and so they're both cultural producers, right? One in the literary sense, and the other in the photographic realm, or visual realm. And so, I mean, the sense that I'm getting in both of their work is that, you know, the storytelling is very much, even in the clip that you showed, there's very much a relational dimension of the work being done in community. And so the idea of voice as being like a relational accomplishment comes through very strongly in both of their work. In Dawood Bey, you know, really allowing the existence to be recognized and validated in the photographs, and building that relationship with the people, however short and fleeting it may have been, but orienting himself in that way to fully humanize his figures in his photographs. And so I mean, that's initially, this is the sense that I'm getting in learning about the work. So it's about relationships, humanizing, and amplifying voices and validating people's presence and existence.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, and Bey says that a lot of his work has to do with history. So I think, you know, he's one of these big questions that he's asking with his work, which I think is a nice parallel also to Walter Dean Myers, is like, how do we get Black faces, Black stories, Black people into the American narrative that they have been so routinely and systematically pushed out of? And I like what Melissa said in the chat box, is the idea of the individual in his or her community. So rather than here is the whole community as represented by one individual, it's like the other way around. This is a set of individuals participating, creating a community. And Deborah's added the willingness to let persons be who they honestly are. Thank you so much. So I always overpack. We don't have time to do all of this, and I'm not going to subject you to the like mad rush, but my intention was to ask you to go back to the text and kind of with that photograph in mind, with the idea of like how close Bey is, and let me back up so that we can see that. You're going to watch me go in the wrong direction. There we go. You know, in this photograph, we get to stand fairly close to these figures. We could analyze their body language and start to think about like, you know, how do we behave when we know we're posing for a photograph, and how do we behave when we're just kind of resting in front of the camera? How do we behave when we are in front of somebody that we feel judged by? How do we behave when we feel like that person has just kind of disappeared into the woodwork or the brickwork in this case? We could play with that idea of proximity and think about how the narrator in Big Joe's funeral gives us proximity to these goings on in the neighborhood. But really what I'd like to zoom in on, because we have just a few minutes, is to start thinking about that last question. In what ways do the text and photo speak to each other? How would it be to go back to Big Joe's funeral after looking at that photograph? What might you see that you didn't see the first time? Or what new ideas might you have? I turned around and saw. Laurel, tell me more about that. I like that. What are you thinking? Or anybody else, feel free to jump in. In what way do they talk to you? Ah, beautiful. Thank you. So Laurel's just added, they've just returned to the text, and this was the first thing, the first phrase. And what a lovely phrase to partner with that photograph, this idea of turning around and seeing, in this case, a photographer. Anything more? Beautiful. Perhaps feeling closer to the action, having seen two young boys who might be at home in the community that Myers was describing. So, right, starting to think about, like, you know, your warm-up. My challenge to you in the warm-up was to think about a moment that feels like a community moment for you, and then also recognizing, what do you understand that somebody outside of your community might not understand, and how does that lack of understanding from the person from the outside kind of change their perception of what's going on in this dear to you community? Deborah's noting the juxtaposition of someone coming into life and someone looking to leave. I love that. So what an interesting, if we're going to follow down that metaphorical path, that's really lovely. Like the two viewpoints in the halves of the photo. Wonderful. Anything more? My last query for you in 5 minutes or less.
On page 6.
Jump in.
Yes. They searched the coffin, the hearse, all of us, and two guys who were just sitting on their stoop, but they didn't find anything because naturally there wasn't anything to find. Then one of the officers received a message on the radio and got real excited. So these boys could have been in that scene where this was going down with the search of the hearse and what's happening, and yet they're innocently apart from what's going on. They're just observers looking at what's going on now, but they're not alarmed because they're not a part of any mischief or trouble.
Thank you. Thank you. So the different places, the physical places when we are observing a scene, and Melissa, I appreciate what you said about speaking about getting into interior life, and that connects to what Cynthia was saying to me anyway earlier about like the access to these little bits of information and the wealth of knowledge and you know, sense of humor in Big Joe's funeral. You know, like he's striking his own path for sure. So if we were to think about these two kind of texts, the literary text and the photographic text, as being explorations of belonging, what new perceptions do you have about belonging or of belonging? Or what has been reinforced for you if there is no new idea?
When you're a part of a community and you're a teenager or adolescent, you more or less just accept things that are happening around you. There's not too much analysis, there's curiosity and awareness, but it's not like you're critical. You're not you lack the maturation to just really call someone an idiot or someone crazy or whatever. You just accept it as colorful personalities do interesting things. And as young people, we often wanted to be a part of that. We wanted to see it in action just because they were funny people.
And that's to me, a really strong connection to what Bay's up to, even as an older man, you know, as a photographer, he's sort of accepting these people that he's saying, can I come take a photograph of you? I accept you as you are, and we're going to work together to develop this photograph together. I'm seeing in the chat box commonality encompassing people with wildly different ideas and backgrounds, that is not a homogenous, it's a heterogeneous group. Familiarity, there we go. So the two boys seem comfortable with each other, and the people in the short story seem comfortable with each other as well. A sense of place. So there are a lot of different ways that we could use this if we wanted to analyze different threads, but this is just kind of like a quick version. When again, if we had a million more minutes and I didn't overstuff things, the next question might just be a takeaway one, which is kind of thinking about when we juxtapose these two things, the photograph and the text, how might that extend or challenge your students thinking about composition? So we started to think about composition fairly explicitly with the photograph, but we might bring that discussion of composition back to the text. We've touched pretty solidly on this question of community, but then also, and again, I wouldn't want to start this conversation without enough time to cover it, but questions about race and expectations about race, representation of Black Americans, and how in both of these cases, these Black writers, Black photographer are considering their place in conveying values and value through their work. So again, I don't want to start a conversation we don't have time to finish, but those would be good, perhaps, mulling points for all of us. I'm going to stay on for 5 or so minutes if you want to brainstorm. Like usual, we have all of these resources are going to be available to you all. And in the tail end of this PowerPoint presentation, I have a couple of what I consider to be fairly interesting pairings of other photographs by Black creators and other poems by Black writers. So those are in there for you for the future. I'm going to stop the recording.